It's funny that I'm about to say this, but election season is upon us. Have you noticed that? Anybody else notice that? Didn't we just end an election? It's like they never go away, right? Does anybody else ever feel like that? It's like elections never go away. And I started to think about that this week and why that is, because it just even with presidential elections, you think 4 years to do something and then run an election again. But what's interesting is the current president was the fastest ever to file for re-election. I mean, he filed within the first year of him being in office. That's the soonest anybody has ever said, "Yep, I'm going to run again." Now, he's perfectly, free to do that. But there's just this mode of, we got to get to the next election. We got to do, that next thing that's 2, 3, 4 years down the line sometimes. And so we see this broad swath of people coming out of the woodwork. I want to run, and I want to run, and I'm going to run. And so they're starting up their election campaigns. They're getting people on the ground. They're getting people out to tell others, come vote for this individual. So then why are elections so exciting? Some might even say hostile. Why are elections, all these different things that they are? Why is there this drive, this almost incessant need for politicians to get out there so many years in advance and say, I'm going to run for this office? Well, you may disagree with what I'm about to say, but I believe that it's because during campaigns, that's the time when politicians can say what they believe they're going to do right. So during the time that they're governing, they're dealing with a bombardment of people, their constituents, which they should be dealing with those. They're dealing with their constituents calling in and saying, hey, this is going wrong. Hey, you need to fix this in our area. Hey, can you help out with this and this and this? So when they're in election mode, they get to put all that aside, and they get to stand up behind a podium and say, I can solve the problems that are ailing our society. Look to me as the one who can fix all of these things. We've heard politicians speak this way before, yes? I'm not the only one who hears that kind of language come out of them. There's a positivity about campaigning that each and every one of us knows deep down just isn't the way the world functions, right? You go to work or the grocery store or where else you go in your life, and you see people hurting. You know that the world doesn't operate in this utopian kind of perfect society that each and every politician stands up and says, I'm going to make it like that. Right? We hear these promises, but we all know the promises don't meet reality. But there's something, we're addicted to that positivity. We're addicted to that language of we want it to be like they are envisioning it, even though we know that's not coming anytime soon. We know what they're saying isn't the truth because each one of us is still living and we have ears, and so we hear them and we know it's just not true. We go to work and to school and the grocery store, we see people living real lives that don't fit this utopia being built up. And the truth is, I think the church often functions that way as well. People go to church. Why? Jim was talking about it. Lacey talked about it a little bit. Why do people come to church? Because they want to feel good, right? They want to come to church so they can hear a positive, uplifting message, tell me that everything is all right in my life and I can go home and then do whatever I want. I think the truth is that's how a lot of Christians understand coming to church. And so we avoid difficult texts. We skip over problem passages, and some of you are probably thinking, yeah, you've done the same thing. And you're not wrong. There are some passages so far in Matthew that I have skipped over, not necessarily because I view them hard, but because I wanted to focus on other things. But the parable of the wedding feast, if you took the time to read it this week, you might have been troubled a little bit by it. The king destroys a city. He sets a city on fire simply because some people refused to come to his feast. If God is the king, is that really the way we want to envision God? God destroying a city simply because people wouldn't come and eat with him? Or how about the person who shows up but doesn't have the right clothes on? Wait, I thought we weren't supposed to focus on clothing. Why is this person being thrown out? Simply because they don't have the right clothes. This is a difficult parable, I think, at times for a lot of people. And so it gets overlooked. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to focus on it this morning. Because church can't just be about you coming and expecting to hear some positive message that I'm going to tell you that everything's all right in your life, and then you can go home and nothing needs to change. No, the truth is there are lots of things that need to change in our lives. And this parable is one of the parables to me that helps highlight that for us. Because we serve a God who is not only merciful, but also just, who expects for His justice to be worked out in the world eventually. And we see that in the story. All right. No more setup. Let's read it for the time being. Dan's going to advance it for me. From Matthew chapter 22. We're going to start in verse 1 here. So Jesus also told them other parables. He said, "The kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a king who prepared a great wedding feast for his son. When the banquet was ready, he sent his servants to notify those who were invited, but they all refused to come. So he sent other servants to tell them, 'The feast has been prepared. The bulls and fattened cattle have been killed, and everything is ready. Come to the banquet.' But the guests he had invited ignored them and went their own way, one to his farm, one to his business. Others seized his messengers and insulted them and killed them. The king was furious, and he sent out his army to destroy the murderers and burn their town. And he said to his servants, 'The wedding feast is ready, and the guests I invited aren't worthy of the honor. Now go out to the street corners and invite everyone you see.' So the servants brought in everyone that they could find, good and bad alike. And the banquet hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to meet the guests, he noticed a man who wasn't wearing the proper clothes for a wedding. 'Friend,' he asked, 'how is it that you are here without wedding clothes?' The man had no reply. And the king said to his aides, 'Bind his hands and feet and throw him into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" It's a difficult parable. On its face, right? On the surface, it's a difficult parable. I hope that what I'm going to say this morning sheds a little bit of light on it for you, so that maybe you don't leave so disturbed thinking about it after I'm done. The first thing I want to talk about is about feasting. Everybody knows that I like potlucks. This isn't a potluck sermon, okay? As much as I want it to be, this isn't a potluck sermon. But I am going to talk about feasting for a moment. Because feasting in the Old Testament has a rich tradition in Scripture, okay? It's all over. I'm not going to point you to every place, but I want to talk about a little bit. A couple of weeks ago, I preached a sermon on the rich young man. And I hope that whenever I did that, I communicated to you that I wasn't outright condemning wealth, just wholesale condemning wealth, because that's certainly not what I intended to communicate in that sermon. One of the things I was trying to communicate, though, is that wealth can become a barrier to people following Jesus, which it was for the rich young man. That's what I was trying to get across, because Jesus doesn't just condemn wealth completely. Throwing feasts in the ancient world meant that you were wealthy. Poor working people didn't throw feasts. There was no way they could ever save up enough money to throw a feast like what is being described in this story. Jesus is telling the story of a rich person inviting people in to come and eat. And feasting, like I said, is something that the wealthy people do. And what's interesting is that God prescribed feasts in the Old Testament. Okay? You probably remember a few of them. Again, we don't have time to go through all of them, and my guess is most of you would be bored if I were to just sit here and go through all the feasts that are mentioned there. But things like Exodus 12. You probably remember Exodus 12. They're in Egypt, and before they leave Egypt, what does God tell them to do? He inaugurates the first Passover feast. Commemorate the fact that I am liberating you from Egypt. And then every year at this time, remember that I've done this, and feast together. Again, feasts are lavish occasions. We're not talking about just a normal, sit down at your dinner table kind of meal. We're talking about a week-long celebration, festivity of just feasting and gorging themselves, because God is so abundantly gracious to us. He's given us so much that we want to honor Him by doing that. See, that's what potlucks are, everybody. I told you this wasn't going to be a potluck sermon, but when you forsake coming to potlucks, you're forsaking the goodness of God. Okay, all right, I'm done. Exodus 34, we see God talk about another feast. And then also in Leviticus 23, all over in the law, we see God talking about this feasting over and over again. The purpose behind it is that when the people feast, they're supposed to remember this is God who has abundantly and graciously blessed us. And so we honor Him by celebrating together. Because of this fact, the wedding feast in this parable, it has a special kind of significance to the Palestinian Jewish people who are listening to Jesus at this time. When He talks about a feast, this is the kind of thing that they're immediately going to, relate it to. If this king is throwing a feast, it's because God has blessed him, and that He's inviting all these people is a sign of blessing as well. There's some other historical elements that I want to talk about here for a moment. That'll advance. It's not advancing, Dan. Would you tap it for me? Thank you. One interesting historical element that plays a part in this parable is that of the double invitation. You probably noticed that in it. Now, why does the king send out 2 invitations to the guests? Doesn't one invitation suffice? Well, one of the things that I found interesting as I was thinking about it this week is we actually have double invitations for weddings in our own contemporary society. If you've been, if you've gone to a wedding recently or been invited to one, you probably received a save the date first, right? And then a few months later, once more preparations have been made, all those kind of things, then the bride and groom-to-be send out the official invitations, right? So they send out the little cutesy, artsy save the date. It's usually got some nice picture on it. It's a magnet you can stick up on the refrigerator to remember this upcoming day, like you're going to forget, because they plaster it everywhere. But then they send out the official invitations. Now, the invitations of the king don't serve the same function necessarily that ours do of the save the date and then the invitation. But the idea is somewhat similar of this extra reminding. So what happened with these invitations? The first invitation that's sent out to the people to come to a feast at this time is an invitation just to hear back, yes, you will come, or no, you will not. The date has not been set. The preparations have not been made because feasts in the ancient world took a long time to prepare for. Months, some time to prepare for. But you have to remember, there's no refrigeration back then, right? There are no official catering services who keep warehouses full of food and goods, paper plates and things to use. They didn't have that. And so it took them a long time to prepare for a feast like this. So what a wealthy person would do, send out those invitations and say, hey, when I'm ready, or when this is ready, will you come partake in this feast with me? Well, no wealthy person at that time is going to say no, because this is high society. This is where you go to talk with other people who are up there in the ranks with you. You don't say no to an occasion like this, especially, as Jesus uses in this parable, a king. You don't refuse a king. The second invitation is to say, everything's ready. It's time to come. And usually that second invitation would be sent out maybe just mere days in advance. Because again, it took so long to prepare for this. Food only stays good for so long. And so now the moment of truth has come for these people. Are they going to respond? Are they going to be true to their word? The servants are sent back out to the people who have already said, yes, I will come when the feast is ready. And now that it is, we see what happens in the story, right? In the parable, Jesus tells us that when the servants are sent back out, they get unfavorable responses from the people. So I suspect you already begin to see some of the ways that Jesus has spoken in this way. Think back last week, I talked about the little parable briefly of the 2 sons. There's one son who, he's playing Xbox, and the father says, hey, I need to get out and rake the leaves in the yard. Nah, Dad, I don't want to do that. I'm not going. I'm too busy. I'm playing Xbox. Leave me alone. And then later on, he goes and does it, right? Then there's the other son who says, absolutely, I'm going to go do that for you. You got it. You can count on me. And then he doesn't go. We can already see some of these themes replaying themselves over and over again in these parables that Jesus is using. But there are a few more that we're going to talk about here in just a moment as we talk about the lessons from this parable. The first lesson that I want you to take away from this morning is that I believe this parable is about evangelism. This is a difficult topic to talk about, in all honesty, because most of us don't want to consider ourselves evangelists. And an evangelist is simply a person who says, I'm going to tell other people about the gospel of Jesus, right? I have good news to speak. I want other people to hear that good news. Therefore, I have to use my mouth, right? I have to speak to other people about the good news so that they can come and be part of the feast as well. I think that's a central and integral part of what is going on in this parable. All of us in this room have answered the invitation to come to the feast. We're part of it. Or we have to envision ourselves as the guests who are already at the feast partaking. I mean, partly we just did that, right? There's a feast that we all partake of every week in the body and the blood. But there's also a feast of encouragement, a feast of being together, right? Of drawing on each other's strengths, of challenging each other to be better. That's part of the feast as well. You and I are a part of that each and every week. We've committed to that. But we know a lot of people who haven't. So we get together, we worship, we sing and we pray, we confess and encourage, and we eat Jesus' body and drink His blood. We are guests at the wedding feast already. We have arrived. And that's good news, right? I want to celebrate that. I want to be thankful for that you're here and that I'm here. But that can't be all that being a guest at Jesus' feast is about. And I made this point in other sermons before, but I think it bears repeating now. We're at the feast, and that's great. But we know lots and lots of people who aren't here yet. Some have already rejected the invitation, right? They've already said, no, I don't want anything to do with that. Others know about the invitation, but they're unsure what they need to do with it, right? They don't get it yet. And so they need somebody to come along and say, okay, here's what you do with that invitation, right? You say yes, and here's how you do that. Because we know how good it is to say yes to the invitation to the feast. Am I wrong about that? We know how good it is to be guests at this feast. I don't hear any amens. No agreement on that. Everybody's like, what? What is he talking about? Guys, we're at the dinner table of God right now. That's good news. And you ought to be excited about that. I mean, that ought to put a fire in your bones that you can't help but be excited that Jesus is in your life and that other people need to hear that from you. Because you're a guest at the wedding feast. And others need to be invited as well. And so we have the task. We have this evangelism piece of this parable that's placed on us to make sure that other people hear that invitation, receive that message, so that they can come here and be part of the feast as well. Many of you in this room remember a time when this auditorium was pretty much full. You remember a time when that upstairs area behind you was pretty much full, when there were hundreds of people sitting in this room each and every week. Do we have hundreds of people in here each and every week anymore? No. No, we don't. So what do we do about that? Well, I've heard several people over a little over a year here kind of fret about that. What's happening? Why aren't there more people here? What are we supposed to do about it? So they come to me and they ask me, what are we going to do about it? And I'm sitting there thinking, I don't know. You've been here 30 years. What have you been doing about it? Like, what do you expect me to do in 2 months or a year? What are we doing about it? We're at the feast, right? We're excited to be at the feast, aren't we? It's good news that we're here, isn't it? So why aren't there more people? Whom have we spoken to in the last couple months that you've invited to the feast? That you've said, hey, I sit at the Master's table. I want you to come sit with me. Is that a message that we're presenting to other people in our lives? And I don't ask that question in a harsh or judgmental way. I hope you understand that. I don't mean that to be degrading toward you or disrespectful or anything like that. I mean it to be a challenge. Not just because we all want to see the room filled. I ask it because I want people to meet Jesus. I want people to come and feast at His table because that's where abundance and generosity and graciousness abound. That's where love is truly found in this world, sitting at the Master's feet. So I want other people to know that, and I want you to want other people to know that as well. And the final point this morning is that many are called, but few are chosen. And this is the part of the parable to me that's really difficult. The evangelism part, well, at least it's easy to talk about. It's hard to do, right, at times. We get scared of talking to people, and I get that. But this, to me, is the part of the parable that's a little more difficult. And there are several pieces of this that make it somewhat difficult, and so they need to be addressed. So let's do that. First, let's talk about the burning of the city. Because this seems like a little bit of a harsh overreaction on the part of the king, right? Okay, so some people rejected your invitation to come eat. So you kill them all and burn where they live? How is that an appropriate response, right? I mean, I've had people refuse to come and eat with me, and I didn't go murder them that night. Is this parable telling me I could do that? Is Jesus giving me license to take out divine retribution on people that spurn my generosity? No, of course not. So, what is going on here? Well, I think probably, to me, the thing that Jesus is talking about here is He's looking forward to the destruction of Jerusalem. I think that in this parable, Jesus is predicting that what's about to come in just a brief 40 years after His life, that this destruction, this overthrow of these people who believe that they've got it all figured out, right? That they know who God is, they know the direction that God is going. God is saying, I'm done with that. I am overturning that. That's not the direction I'm going any longer. And you rejected my Son while He was on earth. And so then there's that hard question, but wait, didn't the Romans destroy Jerusalem? So how do we square that with God uses the Romans? Well, the truth is, we have examples, a plethora of examples in the Old Testament of prophets talking about God using foreign pagan armies to do His bidding. Right? The Babylonians work on behalf of God. Now, maybe they don't know it, but that's how Jeremiah and Isaiah talk about it. The Assyrians are used on behalf of God to destroy the Israelites. Again, they don't know it. They don't worship God, but God is using them to fulfill the purposes that He needs from them. And I think the same thing is true of the Romans as well. And I think that's what Jesus is talking about here. The destruction that's coming upon you, you're bringing on yourselves because you're rejecting the invitation to come to the feast. All right? I know it's a hard lesson, but I think that's what Jesus is talking about. The second difficult piece is that not all who believe they are in are actually secure. So this is actually consistent with Jesus' message all throughout Matthew, and here it is symbolized by the clothes. The man who shows up, and the king sees him and goes, I don't know about what you're wearing right now. It doesn't what I expect, and so get out where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. What? Okay. So again, people show up. So if people show up at church and they don't have the right clothes on, we get to kick them out? That sounds good, doesn't it? No. If you're thinking it sounds good, you're wrong. That's not what's in this parable. It's not what Jesus is talking about. So what's He talking about? This person who's not dressed properly in wedding clothes. What's going on there? Well, I think the symbolism here has to do with deeds of faith. So it's just true in Protestantism that we have, how to say this, diplomatically, politically, I'm going to say it without burning too many bridges. We have overemphasized faith and far underemphasized works. Okay? It's just true of Protestant churches. We have talked far too much about having faith and far too little about doing the works that God is calling us to do. And the truth is that there's a marriage of the two of them. I've always thought about them as two sides of one coin. You can flip it, you get heads, tails, you get faith works, it doesn't matter. They go together, right? Because whenever you turn the coin over, the other side of that is still there and still just as deeply and intimately important to your faith and to who you are as a person of God, that they can't be separated. But far too often in Protestantism, we've tried to separate them, that it's only about your faith. If you just profess your faith in Jesus, then you're good, right? You don't need to do anything else. No, because that's not what Jesus talks about at all. He very much talks about over and over again the fruit of your labor. Are you the kind of person that is producing fruit in your life? And I think that's what the clothes symbolize in this parable. I think what Jesus is saying is that this person who isn't wearing the proper wedding clothes means that they haven't produced the kind of fruit in their life, that they don't really belong at this feast with us. Again, that's a harsh teaching, right? He says it elsewhere, not all who call Lord, Lord are going to be saved, right? It's difficult, but it's in keeping with the things that he said all throughout that Matthew have recorded of Jesus. So it's difficult, but it's not inconsistent, okay? The third thing that's difficult is that some who are called refuse to give up what they believe to be more important, to come and join the feast. And so here, I believe this parable actually connects back to the story of the rich young man that I talked about a couple of weeks ago. Again, in that story, he allowed his wealth to come between his desire, right? He wanted to do what was right. I believe that in that story, he's asking Jesus sincerely, what do I need to do? And so Jesus tells him, I'm looking at you, and I feel like your wealth is getting in the way of you really following me. And the guy essentially says, yep, you're right. I can't give that up. And so here we see a couple of people. Jesus in the parable says one goes to his farm, another goes to his business. I think Jesus is emphasizing here, underscoring the attitude of these would-be and hopeful guests, that they are valuing something in their life more than they're valuing that invitation to come to the feast. It may not be wealth for you, right? I talked about that a couple weeks ago with the rich young man. It may not be wealth. But you and I have to make sure that there is nothing at all getting in the way of our following Jesus. Nothing at all. No relationship, no wealth, no material whatever it is. We have to make sure that Jesus comes first. And so our jobs come second. Our relationships, our spouses come second. Sorry, dear, I love you. Our children come second, right? They just do. And if they don't, then we're like the people who are rejecting the invitation. And so we're not at the feast. And again, that's a hard teaching. But Jesus is just very serious about this business. He's very serious about this following God business. And so we have to be serious about it too. We can't take it lightly. The fourth and final thing to take away from me from this is that God punishes those who spurn His kindness, who reject His graciousness. You know, this is not something I enjoy preaching about, right? I'd rather preach the happy-go-lucky, everything's right in the world sermons. Those sound better to me, and they ring more true to me. But it's here, and I can't ignore the fact that there's punishment here. I can't ignore the fact that there's judgment here. And I'm not saying that I perfectly understand what to do with all of that. But it's here, and so we have to deal with it. Jesus ends the parable very appropriately, that many are called, but few are chosen. And here's the deal. A lot of us like to decide who the few are that are chosen. Right? We're really good at picking out the few. We look at people and we go, he's part of the many. She's part of the many. Right? Get out. You're not worth this, right? You're not worthy. I don't want to waste my time on you, those kind of things. That's not up to us. The king is the judge. The king is the one who says, this person is wearing the proper clothes. This person has done what they need to be a guest at my feast. And so we have to make sure that we're not putting ourselves in the role of the judge. It's that whole thing in Matthew about, the speck in somebody else's eye, but you got the plank sticking out of your own. Again, these themes are constantly cropping up back in Matthew. Yeah. So if you've been reading along with us, it's very consistent with what Jesus is saying. And so our task, I think, is wrapped up in the last part of that phrase, many are called, but few are chosen. I'm sorry, in the first part, not the last part. The first part, that many are called. We're the servants who do the calling. We're the servants who do the calling. So we're back to that evangelism piece again. We're the servants who do the calling. Our task is to make sure that call goes out like it's supposed to. So just a couple of questions to end with. First, whom are you going to invite to the abundant wedding feast? You should have a name. You should have a mental image of that person in your mind already. Whom are you going to invite to the abundant wedding feast of God? But it's not just enough to think about them, right? Thinking about them is good. Now you need to go and do. Now they need to hear that invitation to come to the wedding feast. And then the second thing to take away, do your deeds match your faith? It's easy to come to church and talk to other people and act like you have faith. That's the easy part. Right? We're all good at faking things. Dare I say, we're all good hypocrites. We're all good at that. So I'm including myself in that. This isn't a judgment against you. I'm part of that as well. We're all good at faking who we want other people to think we are. The real question is, when you leave here today and you go back and you do whatever you do during the week, do your deeds match your faith? And if they don't, what needs to change so that they do? It doesn't sound like good news, but it is. It is good news because you're at the wedding feast. You're in a place that's no more abundantly gracious and forgiving than at the feet of Jesus. And that's where we are this morning. And so maybe your deeds don't match your faith, and you want to let us know about that. We're about to stand and sing, and that's why we're here. We can encourage you and pray for you and help you in this journey of faith. And if we can do that, we want to do that. So we have this time as we stand and sing. Come forward if you need to.